So I'm sitting here with Dr. John Ruggie. Professor Ruggie is based in the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard, and he's also duly appointed in Harvard Law School. He's been identified by the Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 25 most influential international scholars in the United States and Canada. He's also long been involved in practical policy work, most notably having drafted the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. They constitute to date the most comprehensive and authoritative global standard in the area of business and human rights, and also the subject of today's discussion. So I want to thank you, John, so much for taking the time to discuss your experiences in drafting the standards and a bit in how the implementation has been going. So I thought we'd begin by talking about the process that you followed in developing the standards. I understand at the beginning it was mostly a descriptive initiative where you were looking at sort of describing what the problems were regarding human rights and business activities, and then seeing what the international landscape of laws and regulations and policies were and where the gaps were located.
That's correct. This was a mandate under the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council. And at first, they didn't really want me to do very much, except to identify what the sort of major patterns were of corporate-related human rights issues, and what the prevailing standards were that applied to states in relation to business and human rights. And what, if any, legal or other standards existed that applied to companies. So it was very much a factual mapping exercise initially. It was an intensely consultative process. We conducted more than 50 or nearly 50 international consultations on every continent. And so nobody could say, you didn't hear our story or you didn't take our situation into account. So that was the second element. Thirdly, before we put together any set of recommendations, we wanted to try them out to see whether they'd actually work. So one of the things that we promoted very strongly in the guiding principles is the idea that companies ought to do what we call human rights due diligence, or ought to adopt human rights due diligence processes. Before we said that, we actually worked with 10 companies to see what that would look like inside a company. How would it work? How would it be embedded into various business units and business functions? And they did that for a year or so and issued a report. We consulted with corporate lawyers on the same subject. And then we had some concrete evidence how this could work in practice.
So the 10 companies, did they help shape the standards, or they really just helped test the standards?
We came to the exercise with some basic ideas of what needed to be done. None of us had ever worked inside a major multinational corporation. And so there's a number of things that we didn't really know how the ideas would play out. And it wasn't until they tried to explain to their procurement department or to their Asian division or whatever what the issue was that we realized that there were refinements that needed to be made and better explanatory material that needed to be provided.
So I found something quite amazing. One, that you were able to get 10 companies to agree to anything, but more impressive is that you were able to get the International Chamber of Commerce to support your work, both the standards and their implementation. So my very little experience with trade associations is that they tend to accept, or at least not fight, initiatives that benefit all of their members somewhat equally. So large multinational companies and smaller companies, the more angelic sort of companies who are on the cutting edge of corporate social responsibility, the middle average company, and then the ones that are bringing up the rear who need the most help. So I was amazed. So how did that happen?
Well, we reached out to all major stakeholder bodies right at the beginning. I mean, the minute I was appointed, I started meeting with Human Rights Watch. I started meeting with the International Chamber of Commerce. I started meeting with government officials. And I just made it clear to everyone that this was going to be, the process itself was going to be a multi-stakeholder process. Because there wasn't any way that we were going to come up with meaningful rules that would simply be imposed by one set of actors on others. This had to be something that had traction on the ground. So the business community was present from the start, which they typically are not in human rights related issues. They're usually the target. And it's states and activist groups who are in the room doing the negotiation. I said from the beginning that's not going to work. Right. The business community needs to be here. It turned out, in fact, to be very helpful. We did have problems with some, but we had problems with some states, and we had problems with some activist groups. So there wasn't anything uniquely different about the problems that we had with the business groups.
So I read that Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, picked you because you had two very important qualities. And I wonder if those qualities aren't what contributed to your success in bringing these different stakeholders together, united around one set of principles, which is an amazing feat. And so Kofi Annan said that he was looking for, and you had, a competency in both human rights and business, which was unique, but you also had a neutrality. You did not clearly represent the business side, the government side, or the activist side. Do you think that that was what those unique qualities that you embodied really help bring about the project? And are those qualities something that other people need if they're going to also think about developing standards for businesses?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, the idea. I mean, you have to know something about the subject. That goes without saying. But this was such a controversial area that was so deeply conflicted that to try to get a person from one of the major stakeholder groups to lead the process wouldn't have worked. But I would add a third element to what Kofi Annan said, which is an understanding of how the UN system works. And what it's capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing. I'd worked for Kofi Annan as his Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning during his first term, and saw firsthand, what you could accomplish and what you couldn't, and learned various workarounds when the constraints were, trying to slow you down. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. So let's talk about the principles. So there were 31 in general. What themes did you cover, and what did they look like?
Well, the guiding principles rest on what we call three pillars. One is the state duty to protect against human rights abuses by anybody, not only state agents, but also third parties, which by definition includes business. So the state duty to protect is the first core element. Secondly, an independent corporate responsibility to respect rights. By independent, what we meant was that it wasn't dependent upon whether or not states were fulfilling their obligations, that this was a separate business responsibility. And the third was access to remedy. Rights don't mean very much if there is no access to remedy. And so protect, respect, remedy were the three pillars of the guiding principles. Mm-hmm.
And were there a 32nd or 33rd principle that you really wanted to get in there, but you had to delete, perhaps because you couldn't get consensus around it or some other reason?
I don't know. There wouldn't have been a 32nd principle. There was a crucial decision that had to be made in the end, which is that we were exploring the possibility of a legal instrument that would hold companies to account for violation of gross human rights abuses that rise to the level of international crimes. And the message back from governments more than anybody else was that that would in itself be such a complex exercise that there would be no way that the guiding principles could be adopted in the time frame that we had if that were included. And so I issued that as a second sort of recommendation, as a separate recommendation.
So I don't want to gloss over this sort of complicated nature. Why is it so complicated to make something legally binding for multinational companies? It might have something to do with the challenge in piercing the corporate veil. And if it does, what does this mean? And let's talk a little bit more about that challenge.
Well, the challenge of a treaty instrument, I mean, look how long we've been at Kyoto, right? And we still don't have an agreed instrument. When issues are very complex, when interests are highly divergent, when you're aiming for universal coverage, all rights, all rights holders, all countries, all businesses, it is difficult to imagine that you're going to get a comprehensive legally binding instrument anytime soon. So the challenge really is, can you set in motion steps that cumulatively reduce the incidence of corporate-related human rights harm and eventually build up enough of a basis for sort of specific legal instruments to be negotiated to fill gaps.
So we're sort of getting into the approach that you took. It was somewhat in between a mandatory and a voluntary approach, and you call it a heterodox approach.
The sparkling gray zone.
Right. Is there anything else that we should know about this?
Well, it was a deliberate choice that voluntarism in itself was not enough. We've had voluntary initiatives now for many years, and none of them have reached scale and tipped markets.
Can you give an example of a voluntary program that you think hasn't been very successful?
Oh, I'm not saying that they're not successful, but you know, the Global Network Initiative, which involves internet companies and telecommunications companies, I think there's something like 7 or 8 companies in them, and the rest of the world is not covered by it.
Right, okay.
So a voluntary initiative, as the name suggests, companies volunteer to join. They volunteer to undertake certain commitments. They get to define what those commitments are. Typically, there's little external accountability. And they're membership-based, and so they tend to be limited in their impact. So beyond voluntarism, but at the same time, it wasn't conceivable to have a comprehensive treaty instrument that addressed all of these issues at once and try to get it negotiated through 193 countries. And so what we aimed at was an instrument that had wide support among governments, among businesses, and among activist groups and human rights organizations that then could become policy requirements as opposed to international law. And so a number of standard-setting bodies, national and international, have adopted the guiding principles. And so when a company now goes for an investment, a co-investment or investment insurance to the International Finance Corporation, the International Finance Corporation says, yes, we now have the requirement that you respect human rights, and here's what you need to do to demonstrate that.
That's right.
So getting it embedded in various standard-setting bodies, including governments. The UK has just rolled out its national implementation plan for the guiding principles. Right. So in other words, rather than aiming at a single global Archimedean point that isn't there anyway, one step lower, target individual standard-setting bodies, national and international, and get them to endorse it.
So I want to talk about other ways of sort of reinforcing the implementation of these standards. What do you think about the idea of accreditation, certification, and rating systems as means for both perhaps specifying some of the principles as well as encouraging their implementation?
Right, right. Well, one of the things that I was very keen to do is have governments that are supportive of the guiding principles. And by the way, the endorsement in the Human Rights Council was unanimous, and so and you can't get better.
That was amazing, right?
You can't get better than that. But to encourage governments to require human rights reporting. So in the United States now, any U.S. entity that invests more than $500,000 in Myanmar has to issue an annual report, including its human rights impacts and how it's managing them. Mm-hmm. Now, that's an important follow-up step. Now the next follow-up step comes, namely that there isn't a single reporting instrument available. So my team, which has now formed itself into a nonprofit, together with an accounting firm, is developing reporting standards that then can be used. And then when the reporting standards are in place, the next step will be an assurance process that the reporting is accurate. And so the ball keeps rolling.
And so what I found interesting about I think you hint in the direction that you're headed, is that you're not just looking at policy, right? You're looking at outcomes.
Oh, absolutely.
So they have to have a process, but they have to show that there was evidence of outcome, successful implementation.
Yeah, I mean, negotiating a piece of paper is easy. Mm-hmm. Making things happen on the ground is where the challenge is.
So bringing it back to the conference where we'll be showing this interview, people are gathering around to talk about the idea of building some kind of accreditation, certification, or rating system for global health issues in companies. I remember that in your survey of the largest human rights abuses by companies, the second largest type was health-related. Mm-hmm. Could you sort of go through a typology of some of the main concerns that you found or main problems within the area of health?
Well, with regard to health, there were two clusters of issues. One was workplace things, just unsafe and unhealthy workplaces and supply chains, was a huge issue. Mm-hmm. And it even boils down to the most basic safety requirements, as we've seen in Bangladesh, for example. Mm-hmm. So workplace issues having to do with fumes, with lack of safety equipment, and people getting injured, and or being so stressed as a result of mandatory overtime that they were literally hurting themselves. Secondly, in relation to communities, typically. Environmentally related things, gas flaring, polluting of rivers that were the source of fishing for a village, or runoffs from mines that then polluted the waterways from which people drank, and things like that. So it was a combination of workplace issues and spillover effects, if you will, on communities.
So wrapping up, what have been the effects on companies and human rights since the implementation of the guiding principles? Do you see businesses becoming more just and human rights field advancing since their adoption?
Well, you can't generalize about all. There's 88,000 multinational companies in the world, and there's something like 800,000 subsidiaries, and I can't keep track of all of those. But I certainly see a much greater interest in and a much greater capacity to do the kinds of human rights due diligence that we recommended, to establish grievance mechanisms that people have access to. And on the part of governments, the adoption of national implementation plans. On the part of stock exchanges, listing requirements, reporting requirements, they're proliferating at a considerable pace. We're working very closely still in our nonprofit capacity with governments from Latin America to Southeast Asia, and with companies everywhere to embed these things. And in the meantime, the various regulatory agencies. This worked its way into U.S. regulation. It's worked its way into EU regulation. So there is a momentum there that we don't have to worry about. It's moving on its own.
Right. You've provided us with a set of standards and principles that we can rally around. So you've defined for us what we should be looking for, and now it sounds like we can focus on the implementation piece in greater and greater detail every day. So thank you, John, for taking this time.
Thank you.
Learned so much, and I can't thank you enough.
Oh, it's great. Thank you so much. Good luck with the conference.
Thank you.